Good evening. This screen recording includes directions for your strategic planning project due on week 8 as part of the Education 760 class. The reason why this course includes this particular project is because it is a question on your comprehensive exam where you will need to demonstrate and apply UE's model of developing, deploying, and assessing a strategic plan. So there are 9 areas that are talked about in UE's book and are the 9 areas that we discussed in class. And so I've taken these areas and have aligned it to the project and based on your suggestions from last week. So here's some specific directions for the assignment, and I'll walk you through these. But you are to write a paper identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the district's CSIP strategic plan, your district's, and how it differs from UE's process. And you'll need to prepare a 10-minute presentation. You're welcome to do this particular project with a partner if you would like, or you can do it individually. And that may be dependent on your knowledge level of comprehensive school improvement planning, which is what CSIP stands for. So you might not have as much responsibility for developing a CSIP in your district, so you might want to partner up with someone who has had that experience. However you would like to do it is fine. This analysis is meant to, of course, making sure that you're successful on your comprehensive exam. So it really is going to be a good exercise for you in terms of getting you ready for this exam. So let's go ahead and walk our way through each of these 9 particular areas. And before I do that specifically, I just had a thought. You can do this analysis based on perhaps just examining a hard copy of a comprehensive school improvement plan. Many districts post such plans on the web, so that's how you might be able to get a copy of this. But if you look at the state's CSIP planning book that helps districts develop their comprehensive school improvement plans, you will notice that these 9 areas are very similar to the state's model in terms of making sure that these areas are included in a district CSIP. In other words, these are areas that are pretty much required by the state to be included in a district CSIP. If you cannot gain that information from just examining a hard copy of the CSIP, that's when you might want to go to the person in your district who's in charge of that particular process in their district and kind of fill in the gaps where you weren't able to get the information that you needed for your paper. So those are just some thoughts, and let's walk our way through some of these specifics for each of these 9 sections. The first section is the core planning team, and there's a couple of guiding questions to help you think about the core planning team in terms of analyzing the strengths and weaknesses for this particular section. All of these guiding questions are simply that. They're guiding questions. They're not meant to be exactly addressed in your paper, but just to stimulate your thinking about each of the sections. So in your district, how did your district determine who would serve on the planning team? And was the makeup of that core planning team similar to UE's recommendations, where he recommended that it just be board members and the senior executive team or central administration staff? So how does that differ from your district's process? The second section that UE talked about in terms of developing a plan after forming the core planning team is for that team to conduct an environmental scan. So how did your district's core planning team conduct that environmental scan, and compare and contrast that to your district's process, to UE's? The third component has to do with that stakeholder survey. So how did your district's core planning team develop and give a forced choice survey, or did they? And it's okay if they did not. Just talk about that and how that differed from UE's process. Were the questions the same? You know, UE had some very specific questions and not very many. I think there weren't any more than 6. And were stakeholders given the survey, and how what stakeholders were given the survey, and how did your district ensure that representative samplings of different types of stakeholders took that survey? And I think those were Laswell's stakeholder groups talked about in Yui's book. And did your district calculate a confidence interval? Again, it's okay if your district did not. Just talk about why they didn't, or perhaps would that be a good thing for your district to do the next time. The fourth section has to do with that internal audit taken by the core planning team. As you remember, we talked about while your stakeholders are taking the survey, it's a good time for your core planning team to take an internal audit where they're assessing themselves or assessing the district against those 7 Baldrige areas talked about in your book. The fifth section has to do with the data analysis process. So once your core planning team has taken the internal audit and you've gotten survey results back from your stakeholders, who takes time to analyze that data from both of those groups and compare and contrast that particular effort with Yui's process? The sixth section is the development of the mission, the vision, the student learning targets, and strategies. So how did your district develop the plan? And who is responsible for developing each of sections of these plans in terms of the mission, the vision, the student learning targets, which, by the way, looks very similar to objectives in CSIP planning models? And what are the specific strategies aligned to each of those student learning targets or objectives? And again, who developed those things? Who developed the strategies? How does that compare to Yui when he says who should do what? Remember, he talked about the strategies being left up to the practitioners who have the expertise to develop the how aligned to each of those objectives. Did your district use a SWOT analysis to develop strategies? And how would strategy maps help or hinder your district's plan? Strategy maps are much more comprehensive than the strategies that we do in our typical strategies that we identify in our CSIP. So would that help or hinder your district's process? And how did your district get input on all of those different components of the plan? Remember, our committees can't be large and can't be too large, but that doesn't mean that we can't get input once a mission and a vision and objectives and strategies have been developed from other stakeholders. So do you do that through World Cafes? And again, compare and contrast that to Yui. The next part of your project is deployment of the plan. So how does your core planning team deploy the strategic plan throughout the district? And how does that compare with what Yui's recommendations are? And the last part of your paper talks about the assessment of your strategic plan. As you know, the strategic planning process, if it's a part of continuous improvement, should be conducted much more than once every 5 years. It's kind of a process, it's a cycle where you're continually assessing the successes and the challenges or the opportunity gaps that arise in your plans. So how does your core planning team assess those successes and challenges? Are balanced scorecards used to assess progress in your district and explain? And then lastly, how is that plan communicated with the public in terms of its successes and its challenges once all of that has been assessed? So again, these are guiding questions meant to assist you in your project to get your thinking going on addressing each of the 9 sections of the project. Here is the rubric, and I changed this just a little bit based on feedback from last week as well as the previous slide that was just explained. So it's similar to your UFE project. There's a section on content. And here it talks about the 3 different levels of performance, with exemplary being thoroughly addressing each of the 9 sections identified in the handout or the slide that I just talked about. And the second part is analysis and application, where we're looking for that in-depth analysis of the similarities and differences between the CSIP process that you evaluated and the process described in Yui. And the style is the same, exactly the same, as well as the mechanics and the oral presentation being the same in as your UFE project. And so total points, this is worth 150 points as compared to your UFE project worth 300 points. This concludes this recording on your strategic plan project. Thank you for your time, and please never hesitate to contact me if you have any questions at all. I've listed my contact information on the side here, and I look forward to visiting with you further. Thank you very much.